It all began innocently enough, or so I thought. Greg's sudden interest in running seemed strange, given that he had always preferred lounging on the couch with a beer in hand over breaking a sweat. When he first mentioned taking up jogging, I nearly laughed out loud. You? Running? I teased, raising an eyebrow. He just shrugged and gave me a sheepish grin. I just thought it'd be a good way to clear my head. You know, get healthier, he replied, tying the laces on a pair of brand new running shoes that had miraculously appeared in our hallway a few days earlier. I didn't press him about it then, though something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. At first, I found his newfound dedication charming. He would come home from work, change into his workout clothes, and head out for his evening jog, often returning with his face flushed and his shirt damp with sweat. He seemed lighter, happier. I told myself it was good for him, maybe even good for us. After all, I wanted him to be healthy. Who was I to question his efforts to better himself? But over the next few weeks, the routine started to feel a little off. Greg was a creature of habit, but his runs became meticulously timed, almost rehearsed. He always ran the same route, leaving the house at the same hour and returning like clockwork. I didn't think much of it at first, but one evening while folding laundry, I found myself idly staring at the route he'd scribbled down in a notebook. It struck me how often his path took him through Riverside Park, a place we rarely visited before his running phase began. Why that park? I wondered aloud. It wasn't the most convenient option, nor was it particularly scenic. It was just an ordinary stretch of green surrounded by busy streets and a playground. When I asked him about it later, he brushed me off. It's got a good mix of flat paths and hills, he said casually, not even looking up from his phone. The unease that had been quietly building inside me grew sharper. I started noticing other things too. How he would leave just a little earlier each evening, how he'd linger in the shower after his runs, or how he'd seem distracted when I asked him how his jog went. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, after Greg left for his usual run, I decided to follow him. It felt ridiculous, like I was auditioning for some low-budget spy movie, but I couldn't help myself. I slipped into my running shoes and trailed him at a safe distance, feeling a mix of adrenaline and shame coursing through me. Sure enough, he took the same route through Riverside Park. I kept to the shadows, my heart pounding with every step. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that he was just a man on a mission to get fit. But as I rounded a corner, I saw him. And her. She was tall, lean, and effortlessly beautiful, with a high ponytail that swung with every step. They weren't running, no, they were standing near a bench laughing about something. His face was animated in a way I hadn't seen in months, his hand brushing against hers just enough to make my stomach drop. I froze, the cool evening air suddenly feeling like a weight on my chest. I wanted to march up to him, demand answers, scream. But instead I just stood there, hidden by the shadow of a tree, watching them. They didn't touch beyond that fleeting moment, but their body language spoke volumes. The way he leaned in, the way she smiled, it was intimacy, plain and simple. I waited until they began jogging again before I turned and walked back home. I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't hear anything beyond the blood rushing in my ears. By the time I got to the house, I wasn't sure if I was furious or heartbroken, or both. When Greg came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same notebook with his route spread open before me. He walked in, smiling and out of breath, but his expression shifted the moment he saw me. "Hey," he said cautiously, pulling off his shoes. "What's going on?" I didn't answer right away, just stared at him until the weight of my silence forced him to sit across from me. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, but his attempt at denial was pitiful. I didn't even need him to say it, I already knew. "Don't lie to me, Greg," I snapped, my voice trembling. "I followed you tonight. I saw you with her." The room was so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. He didn't deny it again. Instead, he buried his face in his hands and let out a long, shaky sigh. "It's not what you think," he began, but the words rang hollow. "Then what is it?" I demanded, tears spilling down my cheeks despite my best efforts to hold them back. "Because from where I stood, it looked a lot like you were cheating on me." Greg looked up at me, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret, or maybe just fear of being caught. "She's just a friend," he said weakly, but the words felt like a dagger. A friend. I repeated, laughing bitterly. Do you always laugh and flirt with your friends during your evening runs? Or is that just for her? He didn't answer, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Greg opened his mouth as if to say something, but then he closed it again, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I could see the wheels turning in his head, searching for the right words to fix this, or at least minimize the damage. But no words could erase what I'd seen, or the knot of betrayal tightening in my chest. I swear it's nothing serious, he said at last, his voice low and urgent. We just run together sometimes. That's it. That's it. I repeated, my voice rising with each word. You've been sneaking out every evening, lying to me, and cozying up to some woman in the park, and you expect me to believe it's nothing serious? Do you think I'm stupid, Greg? His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. I'm not sneaking out. And I'm not lying to you, he shot back. I never said I was running alone. You're the one who assumed. Assumed. I cut him off, standing up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. You're blaming me for this? You think this is my fault because I didn't ask if you were running with someone else. Greg flinched but didn't back down. I'm not blaming you, he said, his voice quieter now. But you're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just running. That's all it is. Then why didn't you tell me about her? I demanded, my hands trembling as I clenched them into fists. If it's so innocent, why didn't you ever mention her? Why hide it? He didn't have an answer for that, and the weight of his silence hit me like a freight train. My heart sank as the truth settled over me. He wasn't hiding her because she was just a running partner. He was hiding her because she was something more. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. My head throbbed and my chest ached as if I'd run the same route 100 times over. How long has this been going on? I asked quietly, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. Greg hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. A couple of months, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. A sharp pain shot through me, as if his words had physically struck me. A couple of months. That meant every time he'd left the house with his bright new running shoes, every time he'd come home flushed and smiling, he'd been with her. And I had been here, oblivious, believing his lies. Do you love her? The question slipped out before I could stop it. My voice cracked and I hated how vulnerable I sounded, but I needed to know. I needed to hear him say it, even if it shattered me. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. No, he said quickly, almost too quickly. It's not like that. I don't love her. I love you, Anna. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You love me? Is that what love looks like to you? Sneaking around behind my back? Making a fool out of me? It wasn't supposed to happen, he said, his voice thick with desperation. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Well, it did, I said coldly. And now what? Are you going to keep running with her? Keep pretending everything's fine at home while you flirt with her in the park? No, he said firmly. I'll stop. I swear I'll stop. I'll end it. Just don't do this. Don't throw everything away over one stupid mistake. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was just a mistake, that we could move past it and rebuild what we'd lost. But how could I? How could I trust him again when every promise he'd made felt like a lie? I don't know if I can do this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive you. Greg reached across the table, his hand hovering over mine as if he was afraid to touch me. Please, Anna, he said, his voice breaking. I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I don't want to lose you. I pulled my hand away, the gesture small but decisive. You already have, I said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. For a moment Greg just stared at me, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he slumped back in his chair, his face crumpling in defeat. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The apology felt hollow, a desperate attempt to salvage something that was already broken beyond repair. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I think you should go, I said quietly. Go. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Anna, please. Go. I repeated, my voice firmer this time. I need time. I need space. And you need to figure out what you really want. Greg opened his mouth to protest but then closed it again, his shoulders sagging. He stood slowly, his movements heavy with reluctance. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading, but I didn't waver. I couldn't. When the door closed behind him, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sank onto the couch, tears streaming down my face as the weight of everything crashed down on me. I had no idea what the future held, whether we could ever fix what had been broken. But for now, all I could do was sit in the silence and let the pain wash over me. The hours after Greg left passed in a haze. I couldn't bring myself to move from the couch, couldn't even muster the energy to turn on the TV or reach for my phone. My mind churned relentlessly, replaying every detail of the past few months, every moment that now seemed laced with hidden meaning. How many times had I missed the signs? How many lies had I swallowed without question? The memories felt tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge of his betrayal. The way he'd kissed me goodbye before his runs, the easy smile he'd given me as he laced up his shoes, had any of it been real? Or had he been thinking of her, picturing her face even as he stood in front of me? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, standing by the bench, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. The image burned in my mind, refusing to let me rest. By morning, my exhaustion had turned into a dull, simmering anger. I couldn't just sit here drowning in my own misery. I needed answers, closure, something to make sense of the chaos swirling in my head. I decided to go to the park. It felt ridiculous, almost masochistic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Greg might have left, but his running route was still etched into my mind. If he wouldn't give me the truth, maybe I could find it myself. The air was crisp as I stepped onto the trail, my sneakers crunching against the gravel. The park was quiet, the early morning stillness broken only by the occasional chirp of birds, or the rhythmic pounding of another jogger's footsteps. I felt out of place among the runners and cyclists, their determined faces a stark contrast to my own. I wasn't here to exercise. I was here to confront a ghost. As I followed the familiar path, I kept my eyes peeled for anything, any sign of her, of him, of whatever it was they shared. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe I was hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to see her without the filter of Greg's explanations. Or maybe I just wanted proof that this wasn't all in my head. I didn't see her that morning or Greg. The park seemed ordinary, almost disappointingly so. By the time I circled back to the parking lot, I felt foolish for coming. What had I expected? That they'd be standing there, waiting for me, ready to explain themselves? The absurdity of it all made me laugh, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed in the empty lot. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A scarf, bright red, draped over the back of a bench near the edge of the playground. It was the same scarf she'd been wearing the night I saw them together. I was sure of it. My heart began to race as I approached, my mind racing with possibilities. Why was it here? Had she left it behind? Or had someone else, a child perhaps, found it and abandoned it here? I reached out to touch it, hesitating as my fingers brushed against the soft fabric. It felt surreal, holding this tangible piece of her in my hands. For a moment I considered taking it, but the idea felt too strange, too invasive. Instead, I folded it neatly and placed it back on the bench. The next few days were torture. Greg texted me once, a brief message asking if I was okay, but I didn't reply. I couldn't. Every time I thought about him, the hurt flared up all over again, sharp and raw. I didn't know what to say to him. Didn't know if I even wanted to hear his voice. Instead, I threw myself into distraction. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing every surface until my hands were raw. I spent hours scrolling mindlessly through social media, hoping to drown out my thoughts. But no matter what I did, the pain lingered, a constant ache in the back of my mind. On the third night, I decided to go back to the park. I told myself it was just for a walk, a chance to clear my head, but deep down I knew better. I was searching again, though I wasn't sure for what. Answers? Closure? Maybe just another piece of the puzzle. This time the park was livelier. Couples strolled hand in hand, children laughed on the playground, and runners darted past me. their breaths visible in the cool evening air. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning the crowd. I didn't expect to see her, not really. But when I reached the same bench, I froze. She was there. She sat with her back to me, her red scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She was alone, her hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. My heart began to pound as I stood there, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to pretend I hadn't seen her. But another part of me, the part that craved answers, refused to let me walk away. Before I could talk myself out of it, I approached her. She looked up as I drew closer, her expression shifting from confusion to polite curiosity. Up close, she was even more beautiful than I remembered, her features sharp and striking in the fading light. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. There was no hint of recognition in her eyes, no sign that she knew who I was. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. What was I supposed to do? Introduce myself as Greg's wife? Demand to know what she was doing with him? The words felt heavy in my throat, impossible to speak. Instead, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "I think I saw you here a few nights ago. With my husband." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. For a moment I thought she might deny it, but then she nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. "I know who you are." Her admission hit me harder than I expected, as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted. I stood there, staring at her, my pulse racing. The calm in her voice, the steady way she held my gaze. It wasn't what I anticipated.
No estammerin denials, no nerves glances.
Just quiet acknowledgement, as if this moment had been inevitable. "You know who I am," I repeated, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Then you know why I'm here." She nodded again and gestured to the bench. "Do you want to sit down?" she asked, as though we were old friends about to catch up over coffee. "No," I snapped, folding my arms across my chest. "I don't want to sit down. I want answers. Who are you? And what the hell do you think you're doing with my husband?" Her composure didn't falter, though a flicker of something, pity maybe, crossed her face. "My name's Lauren," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And I'm not sure this is the place for." "Don't tell me where the place is," I interrupted, my anger bubbling over. "You don't get to decide that. You've been meeting my husband behind my back for months. I think I deserve to know why." Lauren set her coffee cup down on the bench and clasped her hands in her lap. For the first time, she looked uncertain, as if she were weighing her next words carefully. "It's not what you think," she said finally, the same phrase Greg had used. The same infuriating non-answer that did nothing to soothe the ache in my chest. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you're having an affair with my husband." Her brows knit together, and she shook her head. "I'm not sleeping with Greg," she said firmly. "We're not having an affair." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted so badly for her words to be true. But how could I? How could I trust anything she said when I'd seen the way they looked at each other? The way Greg had smiled at her, so free and unguarded, like she was the center of his universe. "Then what are you doing?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why are you meeting him here? Why are you running together? Why didn't he tell me about you?" Lauren sighed and looked away, her gaze drifting to the playground where a little boy was chasing a squirrel. "It's complicated," she said, her tone apologetic. "Try me." I shot back, my frustration mounting. "I've got time." She was silent for a long moment, her hands tightening around each other in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I met Greg at a support group," she said. "Support group?" The words threw me off balance. That wasn't what I expected. She nodded. "For people dealing with infidelity." Her eyes flicked back to me, and I saw a flash of something raw, something vulnerable that made my breath catch. "I've been going through a divorce. My husband cheated on me and it's been hard. Greg and I started talking after one of the meetings, and we realized we had a lot in common." The anger that had been simmering inside me wavered, replaced by a confusing mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. "So you're bonding over your cheating spouses?" I asked, the words dripping with bitterness. Lauren flinched but didn't look away. "Something like that," she admitted. "Running was his idea. He said it helped him clear his head, and I figured it couldn't hurt to try. That's all it is. Just running and talking. I didn't know what to say. The explanation felt too neat, too convenient. But there was a sincerity in her voice, a quiet pain that mirrored my own, that made it hard to dismiss her outright. Still, it didn't add up. If this was all so innocent, why had Greg kept it from me? Why hadn't he told me about the group, about her? And you never thought to ask if his wife knew about this arrangement? I pressed, my voice sharper than I intended. Lauren looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. I asked him, she said softly. He told me you knew. The words hit me like a slap. I felt my knees weaken, and I had to grip the back of the bench to steady myself. Greg had lied to her too. Or had he? Maybe this was another lie. Another carefully crafted story designed to keep me in the dark. My head spun with questions, doubts, accusations that had no clear answers. Why would he lie? I murmured, more to myself than to her. Lauren hesitated before responding. I don't know, she admitted. But maybe he didn't want to hurt you. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. I let out a bitter laugh. Protecting me? By sneaking around with you behind my back? That's rich. She didn't argue. Instead, she just watched me, her eyes full of something I couldn't name. Sympathy perhaps, or guilt. Whatever it was, I couldn't bear to see it. I turned away, staring out at the park as the wind rustled the leaves above us. I don't know if I believe you, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. But even if you're telling the truth, it doesn't change the fact that he lied to me. That he kept you a secret. Do you have any idea how that feels? To be shut out of your own marriage. Lauren didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with regret. Yes, she said quietly. Ido. The weight of her words settled over us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us eased just slightly, like a storm breaking after hours of relentless wind and rain. But it wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done, the cracks in my trust that ran too deep to be mended with words. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to move forward from this. Lauren reached for her coffee cup, cradling it in her hands like it was the only thing grounding her. You take it one step at a time, she said. That's what I've been doing. Some days it feels impossible. But you keep going, even when it hurts. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Her words felt like both a lifeline and a cruel reminder of the path ahead. A path I wasn't sure I was strong enough to walk. Lauren's words hung in the air, heavy with the truth I didn't want to acknowledge. One step at a time. It sounded simple, almost absurdly so, but the weight of it felt insurmountable. I didn't know where to begin, didn't even know if I wanted to begin. My life, the life I thought I knew, had shattered in an instant, and now I was supposed to piece it back together? Alone? I turned back to her, searching her face for some hint of insincerity, some flicker of ulterior motive, but all I saw was exhaustion. The kind that went deeper than sleepless nights, rooted in the kind of pain that hollowed you out from the inside. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not even close, but perhaps recognition. She wasn't the villain I'd imagined her to be. If anything, she was just as much a casualty of Greg's choices as I was. Still, it didn't absolve her entirely. You might think this was harmless, I said, my voice steadier now, though still edged with anger. But it wasn't. You were part of this whether you meant to be or not. And it hurt me. Lauren nodded slowly, her expression solemn. I know, she said. And I'm sorry. If I'd known. If I'd realized he hadn't told you, I never would have. She stopped, pressing her lips together as if swallowing the rest of her words. The apology should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It just left me feeling more hollow, more unsure of where to direct the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, sadness, betrayal, they all fought for dominance, leaving me unmoored. Does he talk about me? I asked suddenly, the question escaping before I could stop it. It was a moment of weakness and I hated myself for it, but I needed to know. When you're with him, does he mention me? Lauren hesitated, and that brief pause felt like an eternity. Sometimes, she said at last, but not in the way you think. He talks about how much he loves you, how he doesn't want to lose you. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made her flinch. He has a funny way of showing it. I said, shaking my head. If he loves me so much, why didn't he just talk to me? Why didn't he tell me he was struggling instead of running to you? I don't know, Lauren admitted quietly. But I think maybe he didn't know how to. Sometimes it's easier to open up to a stranger than to the person you love. It's not right, but it's the truth. Her words struck a nerve, and I hated how much sense they made. I could see it, in some twisted way, Greg pouring his fears and frustrations into someone who didn't share his history, who didn't come with the baggage of years of marriage. Didn't make it okay. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made it feel less calculated, less malicious, and somehow that hurt even more. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, I said finally. With you, with him, with any of it. I don't even know if I want to try to fix things. Lauren nodded, her gaze thoughtful. You don't have to decide that right now, she said. Take the time you need. Figure out what you want, not what anyone else expects from you. I stared at her, this woman who had unwittingly upended my life, and for a moment I wondered what her story really was. What had her husband done to break her? What pain was she carrying that had drawn her to Greg in the first place? I wanted to ask, but the words felt too heavy, too intrusive. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about me, about Greg, about the mess we'd made of our lives. I should go, I said abruptly, the weight of the conversation becoming too much to bear. I can't do this anymore. Lauren didn't try to stop me. She just nodded, her eyes filled with an understanding that only made me feel worse. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing on the gravel path. The park felt different now, smaller and suffocating, as though the walls of my own mind were closing in around me. By the time I reached my car, I was trembling, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I got home, the silence was deafening. Greg's absence loomed large, a gaping void that seemed to fill every corner of the house. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my mind replaying every word of my conversation with Lauren. It was too much, all of it. The lies, the half-truths, the painful revelations. I didn't know how to process it, didn't know how to move forward. I thought about calling Greg, demanding answers, demanding that he explain himself once and for all. But what would be the point? I already knew the truth, or at least enough of it to know that things would never be the same. Even if he ended things with Lauren, even if he swore to be honest from now on, the damage was done. The trust was gone. And without trust, what was left? I didn't sleep that night or the next. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Greg texted me a few more times, his messages growing more frantic as the silence stretched between us. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I didn't know what to say. Didn't know if there was anything left to say. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had happened. So I packed a bag, threw it in the trunk of my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan. I just needed to get away, to put distance between myself and the life that had unraveled before my eyes. One step at a time, I told myself. One step at a time. But as the miles stretched out before me, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever find my way back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the hum of the tires on the pavement becoming a white noise that filled the silence. I didn't have a destination, didn't even have a clear idea of what I was running from anymore. Greg? The memory of Lauren's calm eyes and steady voice? Or maybe it was myself, the person I'd been before everything fell apart, the person I didn't recognize anymore. The car was stuffy, but I didn't roll the windows down. The air outside felt too fresh, too alive. And I couldn't bear the reminder that the world was still moving on while I was stuck in this limbo. I tried turning on the radio, flipping through static-filled stations until I landed on something soft and acoustic. But even that felt unbearable, the lyrics of longing and heartbreak cutting too close to the bone. I turned it off and drove in silence. Hours passed. Or maybe it was days. Time had stopped making sense to me, marked only by the sun dipping below the horizon and rising again. I pulled over once to sleep in a motel, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and paper-thin walls. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach, and the air conditioning groaned in protest every time I adjusted the dial. I lay awake for most of the night, staring at the cracked ceiling and wondering if Greg was doing the same. What was he thinking? Was he pacing the house, waiting for me to walk through the door? Or had he gone back to Lauren, seeking the comfort I couldn't give him anymore? The thought twisted in my gut like a knife, but I didn't cry. I was too tired for tears, too hollow. I kept driving. The scenery changed from suburban sprawl to open countryside. The kind of place where the fields stretched out for miles and the sky seemed impossibly big. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost mocking. How could the world be so serene when my own life was in ruins? I pulled over at a rest stop, leaning against the hood of the car and staring out at the endless expanse of green. The wind whipped through my hair, tugging at the loose strands, but it didn't bring the clarity I'd hoped for. The solitude wasn't helping. If anything, it was making the ache in my chest sharper, more pronounced. I'd thought that putting distance between myself and Greg would give me perspective, but all it had done was make me feel more lost. I thought about calling someone, but who? My mom would worry, would ask too many questions that I wasn't ready to answer. My friends would try to comfort me, but their words would ring hollow. They couldn't understand. How could they? None of them had been through this slow unraveling of a life you'd spent years building. Eventually, I did what I'd been avoiding since I left. I called Greg. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone as I dialed. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice tight with a mix of relief and panic. "Anna," he breathed, and the sound of my name on his lips sent a fresh wave of pain crashing over me. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know where to start. "I'm okay," I said finally, though the words felt like a lie. I needed to get away for a bit." "Where are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Are you safe?" "Yes," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I'm safe." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him struggling to find the right words. "I've been going crazy," he said finally. I didn't know if you were coming back." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I don't know if I am," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Greg. How am I supposed to trust you again?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know," he said. "But I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes, Anna. Please, just come home. Let me make this right." The desperation in his voice should have moved me, but instead it left me feeling numb. How many times had I heard those words before? Promises of change, of effort, of things being different. And yet here we were. "I don't know if you can," I said, my throat tightening. "I don't know if I can." The line went quiet, and for a moment I thought he might have hung up. But then I heard him exhale sharply. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I've always loved you. And I'm so sorry I let you down." I pressed a hand to my chest, as if I could physically hold myself together. "Love isn't enough, Greg," I said. "It's not supposed to feel like this." There was another long silence, and then he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I'll wait," he said. "For as long as it takes. I'll wait for you, Anna." I ended the call before I could say anything else, before the sound of his voice could break me completely. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my lap, the ache in my chest spreading until it felt like it might consume me. For the first time since I left, I let myself cry. It wasn't the quiet, dignified kind of crying you see in movies. It was messy and loud, the kind of crying that leaves you gasping for breath and clutching at your own skin as if you can claw the pain away. It felt like my heart was shattering all over again, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt and looked out at the fields. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, achingly so, and for a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. The faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe it would take time. Maybe it would take everything we had. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. One step at a time. I stayed there on the hood of my car, watching the sun sink lower and lower until the sky was a deep dusky blue. The faint hope I'd felt flicker in my chest was fragile, almost too faint to hold on to, but it was there. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely paralyzed. I didn't have a clear answer, didn't know if Greg and I could ever mend what had been broken, but I realized I didn't have to decide right now. The weight of trying to solve everything at once had been suffocating me, and for a brief moment, I let myself imagine what it might feel like to take things slowly, step by step as Lauren had said. That night, I checked into another small motel. The walls were thin, and I could hear the muffled voices of a couple arguing next door. Their words were indistinct, but their tone, frustrated, resigned, echoed painfully in my chest. I wondered if they were like Greg and me, caught in the liminal space between love and despair, unsure if the cracks in their foundation could be patched, or if it was better to start over somewhere new. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, lazy circles. My phone sat on the nightstand, dark and silent. Greg hadn't texted again, and I was grateful for the space. I wasn't ready to hear more promises or apologies. I needed to sit with my own thoughts, no matter how uncomfortable they were. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were restless, filled with disjointed images of Greg and Lauren. I saw them running side by side, their laughter ringing out like a taunt. I tried to reach them, but my legs felt like they were moving through wet cement, heavy and uncooperative. When I woke up, my heart was racing, and I felt more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The motel was on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were lined with quaint shops and cafes, their windows glowing warmly in the early morning light. I passed a bakery with the scent of fresh bread wafting out onto the sidewalk and a bookstore with a sign that read, "Take your time. The stories will wait." The irony wasn't lost on me. Eventually, I found myself in a small park, its paths winding through clusters of trees and flower beds. It was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant sound of a car passing by. I sat on a bench near a pond, watching the ripples on the water as a light breeze stirred the surface. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm settling over me, fragile but real. I thought about Lauren's words again, her insistence that nothing had happened between her and Greg beyond their shared runs and conversations. A part of me wanted to believe her. She'd seemed sincere, and the pain in her eyes when she'd spoken about her own marriage had felt genuine. But the doubt still lingered. Even if they hadn't crossed any physical boundaries, there was an intimacy in what they'd shared, a connection that should have belonged to Greg and me, not him and someone else. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Greg had turned to Lauren because I hadn't been there for him in the way he'd needed. It wasn't an excuse for his actions, not by any means, but it was a truth I couldn't ignore. We'd both let cracks form in our relationship, both failed to address the distance that had grown between us. His betrayal wasn't mine to own, but the foundation of our marriage, the good and the bad, belonged to both of us. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long time. I wanted to call him, to hear his voice and try to make sense of everything, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I opened my notes app and began typing. "Greg, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I still don't know how to feel, and I don't know if I'm ready to come home yet. But I think we both need to take responsibility for where we ended up. I'm not excusing what you did, but I also know we let things between us slip in ways we shouldn't have. I don't know if we can fix it, but I think I want to try, if you're willing to put in the work too." I stopped typing and reread the message, my thumb hovering over the send button. Was I ready to commit to trying? To letting him back into my life, even if only tentatively? My mind spun with uncertainty, but a quiet voice inside me urged me to take the first step. Before I could overthink it, I hit send. The message disappeared into the ether, and I sat there, my heart pounding, waiting for a response that might not come. Minutes passed, then an hour. I walked the length of the park and back again, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, but still there was no reply. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ground, my phone finally buzzed. My hand shook as I unlocked it, opening Greg's reply. "Anna, thank you for reaching out. I've been thinking about everything too, and you're right, we both let things slip. I know I hurt you and I know I can't undo that, but I want to try. I want to fix this, not just for you but for us. I'm here whenever you're ready." I stared at the words, a lump forming in my throat. His message wasn't perfect. It couldn't undo the hurt or erase the past, but it felt like an offering, a tentative step toward reconciliation. I didn't know where we'd go from here, didn't know if we'd succeed or fail, but for the first time in weeks I felt like we might have a chance. One step at a time. I stared at Greg's message long after I finished reading it, my thumb tracing the edges of the screen. A part of me wanted to reply immediately, to tell him I was ready to talk, to figure out what came next. But another part, the part still raw and uncertain, held me back.